So it's been a minute. I'm back. I'm sorry. I have short hair now. Don't worry about it. I am so sorry that I have not posted since September 2022. Which, by the way, I am still amazed that it's now 2023 because, like, that's a future year. This is not important. I had this job that was like 10 to 12 hour days and it was just a little bit insane there for a minute. So I actually started this project at the beginning of October and it is now February. I just didn't have all that much time to sew, so I kind of had to work on it in bits and pieces over several months, which is why I'm gonna try a new format for this video. So instead of vlogging, I'm mostly going to walk you through how I put this project together long after the fact with some little gems from Pastor Shawley thrown in there. So before I do anything else, first I just need to say thank you, because as of recording this, I have almost 400 subscribers, which is like insane. I don't know how my subscriber count essentially quadrupled while I wasn't posting. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but thank you to all of you who have been subscribing and commenting while I couldn't post. I do still read the comments, I can't always reply to them. But you're all very sweet, and I hope that we can form like a nice little community here on my channel. And yeah, I know 400 doesn't sound like a whole lot compared to people who have like a bajillion subscribers, but it's kind of a huge number for me because that means like 400 people actually want to watch me sew and make things and make mistakes and be a little bit crazy because, you know, that's what I do. So if you're new, hi, welcome. I'm Roshali and I'm insane. Nice to meet you. But sincerely, thank you. Thank you so much. This is amazing. Okay, so now let's get into what this video actually is. So like I said, I started this in October. And I had realized that I was in need of a new winter coat. So I'd had the same coat for years and years since I was probably a teenager, so it was definitely time for a new coat. And at the time I had also started slowly transitioning my wardrobe towards more like historically inspired things, history-bounding things. So lots of long skirts and trousers and things that don't look so good with a modern coat. Side note, there is nothing worse than putting together the perfect outfit and then having to ruin it with like a puffy winter coat. Absolutely tragic. So what I wanted to do was make a more historically inspired coat. So I found this pattern by Snail. So if you've been on this channel for a while, you may remember the 1890s walking suit I made. So the waistcoat and the skirt, those were patterns from the same company. And I really love their stuff, so definitely go check them out. I'm gonna link this pattern down below. And I am also just in love with the 1890s silhouette. Again, if you've been on this channel, you know this about me. I love the 1890s. So this was the perfect coat to try and make. So I chose view A for the skirt instead of the peplum. I just kind of like the look of that better. But then I had a choice to make. The pattern comes with two sleeve options. You've got the giant leg of mutton sleeves. They look a bit like this. I think they are also called Gigot sleeves? I don't actually know how to pronounce this. Hold on.
Gigot sleeve.
Gigot sleeve? No, surely that cannot be correct.
Gigot.
Gigot. Gigot. Gigot? I'm just gonna call them the leg of mutton sleeves because I don't know. That was such a tangent. I'm really sorry. Editing Roshali's gonna have fun with this bit. So anyway, those giant leg of mutton sleeves, those were more popular around the mid-1890s, if I remember correctly. So the middle of the decade, 1895-ish, they kind of got the biggest that they got. And then they sort of started coming back down. They went a bit more out of fashion and the sleeves became slimmer. So they included both of those patterns, essentially. So they included the giant sleeves and then a slimmer pattern that's more appropriate for like the end of the decade. So they're both historically accurate, but I had choices. And if you know anything about me, you know that I'm not great at making decisions. Essentially what I decided to do was not to decide. So I came up with this idea of doing both sets of sleeves but making them interchangeable. So essentially what I thought to do was attach like snap tape or popper tape. Do you call them snaps or poppers? Because I call them snaps, but I think over here in the UK they call them poppers. Anyway, not important. So I decided to attach snap tape in the arm size and also around the sleeves so that I can basically clip them into place and I can make the sleeves interchangeable. So this is the snap tape. It looks a bit funny right now because I've got all of this left over because essentially I needed 4 sets of the one side and then only 2 sets of the other side because obviously it's the one body of the coat. It does make sense in my head. So it just kind of snaps together like that. So it's like a long ribbon with snaps. Are we focusing on me now? Thank you. I got this on Etsy. I can link that down below if you are in the UK and you would like the exact same, but I'm sure you can find it anywhere. That makes it really easy to attach things without having to like set a bazillion poppers on their own because I don't know how to do that and I don't have the tools for that and I don't have poppers. So yeah, with those two sets of sleeves, I can kind of decide what look I'm going for based on the day. So I can have like a nice history-bounding look with those slimmer sleeves, or if I want to go like full 1895, I've got the giant sleeves. So it's a very versatile coat, which I thought was a good idea. Of course, I must be a masochist because I don't know anybody who wants to do like one set of sleeves, let alone two. Yeah, I did 4 sleeves. Well, actually 8, including the linings. And also, of course, doing 4 sleeves leaves a lot of room for error. So, anyway. So now let us talk about fabric and supplies, and we'll do a little bit of a cost breakdown here because I know it can be a little bit daunting trying to sew your own things and keeping to a budget. So for the outer layer, so I had thrifted a gray blanket ages and ages ago. It was about £8. If you know me, you know I thrift a lot of blankets and I make clothes out of them. Blankets, bed sheets, whatever you like. It was just plain gray fleece, nothing super fancy. It ended up being equivalent to about 4 meters, so I just barely managed to squeeze the pattern out of this. I bought a lovely emerald green satin that was about £3 a meter, if I recall correctly, and I bought about 3 meters of that. I'm sure it must be polyester, but it was £3, so I wasn't gonna complain. But the pattern also called for interfacing. It wanted horsehair canvas. I ended up getting what I think is called a calico canvas. That was about £4 a meter, and I think I got 1 meter of it. I didn't need very much of it because it was mostly for the bodice of the coat. And then it also wanted some cotton batting for padding out the shoulders and helping keep that shape of the larger sleeves. About £3 a meter, and I think I bought 1 meter of that. Then there was the popper tape. That was about £4 for 2 meters. I needed thread, buttons, a thin twill tape for some of the construction, and then the pattern itself was £13. So altogether, I spent less than £40 on this coat, which I think is a really decent price. It's definitely a lot less than buying a good winter coat that would last me several years. So money well spent, I think. All right, so make yourself comfy, make yourself a pot of tea, and let's get to sewing. Oh, I have missed saying that. So the first thing I did was what I call a dirty mock-up, which is essentially pinning all the pieces together and trying it on. This went about as well as you'd expect. Ow, I'm stabbing myself with pins. This is why you do a real mock-up. Okay, ow. So lesson 1, just sew the damn mock-up. You need to like be able to pull against the seams and fit it properly. I did end up at least basting the mock-up, so points for minimal effort, I guess. The mock-up fit pretty well. The only issue was that the waist was a little bit low, so I marked the waistline on the pattern and then I raised it up by 2 inches, and that pretty much solved the problem. So something interesting that I noticed about the pattern is that the seam for the skirt actually sits well below the waist. I thought that was an issue at first because I'm used to making skirts, and when I make skirts I attach them directly at the waist. But the pattern actually does dip in at the waist and then back out, and then the skirt attaches below that, so it actually cuts down on that bulk at the waist. It looked a bit funny on me in the mock-up. I wasn't so sure about it, but I think that was more an issue with me being short-waisted. It's possible the skirt wasn't meant to sit that low. It was like basically at my hips, which is not really where I wanted it. But once I took off those 2 inches above the waist, that worked a lot better. So then it was time to cut out my fabric, and boy howdy did I need more room for this than I thought. And a lot of time. It took a while. In fact, it took so long that I did not pick up the project again for 2 weeks. Oops. So then I cut out the lining, and then a few days later I cut out the canvas. Cutting takes so long, you guys. I think it's my least favorite part of sewing, just cutting everything out. Like I said, this was a very PC project, so I was kind of doing things like when I could, you know, 3 days later, a week later, whenever I had time, basically. So putting the lining together was pretty easy. I started with the bodice, and then I did a quick fitting just to kind of make sure that everything was where it was supposed to be. At this point I also sewed the pockets, which are just the usual inseam pockets that I do for most of my skirts. The pattern did come with welted pockets, but I decided that I'd rather have inseam ones. That's just kind of what I prefer. So I did go a bit rogue there. I didn't really follow the pattern there. I ended up having to cut the skirt pattern piece in half though, to give myself side seams, because the original pattern just had the one seam at the center back. But that kind of worked out better for fitting the pieces on my fabric anyway. Like I said, I barely had enough of the fleece. That worked out pretty well, actually, being able to kind of cut the skirt in pieces. I sort of treated the lining as a second mock-up, so I realized here that the side seams were a little bit too far forward, which meant the back was too big on me. So I actually had to do some math. Are you proud of me? I actually did math without complaining. So I measured from side seam to side seam across the back on the waistline, and then I compared that to half my waist measurement. So then I did the math and I took a little bit off of each of those 3 back seams. So pinned that in, tried it on, sewed the seams again. And then I also sewed the skirt lining and pressed all of my seams. I also pressed my seams! Are you proud of me? I did so many good things in this project. I'm proud of me. Funny story, I was cutting down the seam allowance on the skirt lining, and I chopped straight through the actual lining, which was stupid of me because I didn't lay it out flat, so that one's on me. I have just kind of like patched it back up. It's not ideal, but it is the lining, and I don't have enough fabric to cut out another piece, so it is what it is. Mistakes happen. Let's keep moving. So at this point I had decided that I really didn't like how far down the skirt was. So what I did is I marked the waistline on the bodice. I measured my seam allowance below that, and then I just kind of chopped the bodice. And I attached the skirt there so that it was right at my waist. Now I ended up kind of regretting that later, but we'll get to that. At this point, it all fit pretty well, so I moved on to the fashion fabric. So the first thing I did was adjust my pieces to match the changes that I made on the lining. So all of those back seams needed to come in a bit, but I didn't alter the bottom edge yet. I thought it would be easier to line up the waist seam once the whole bodice was together. So then I flatlined the canvas to the back pieces, just kind of basted them in by hand, and then I could sew those back pieces together. So that was the back all done. And next up were the front darts. So my fabric was not taking any sort of marking device. I tried tailor's chalk, I tried a pencil and a washable marker. None of it was working. So to mark the darts on the front piece, instead I've decided to try tailor's tacks, which I have never done before. They're actually pretty easy to do, and this way I can mark through both layers of the fabric at the same time, because otherwise I thought about like just pinning the thing and basting the darts, but this seemed to make more sense to me. It is pretty simple. Like, I just go down through both pieces of fabric. I haven't knotted the end of this thread, so I just hold it there. And you do the same thing. You go through the same part. And then you're supposed to leave like a little loop. And then you can do it again. So you go in, you go around, make the loop, leave the loop. And then theoretically you should be able to pull apart the layers and just cut in between them. And that way you have thread marking the darts. So I've already done it here. I don't know if you can see that. But you can see that I've marked, now it's like marked through both layers of the fabric because I've already cut through there. Well, that took forever. I had to break out the tweezers because, oh my god, taking out those tailor tacks after sewing the darts was a very bad idea. So lesson learned, baste the seam, then take out the tailor tacks, then sew the darts. So that's on me. I didn't know, now I know. So if you are learning how to do tailor's tacks, now you know. So once the darts were done, I basted the canvas to the front piece following the pattern guidelines. I had decided that I really wanted to try and construct this as it would have been historically. I really trust Black Snail, and the way that they lay out their patterns, it does seem like they're very close to historically accurate as they can be. So I wanted to try all of these techniques that I hadn't tried before. So that involved pad stitching. And I'd never done pad stitching before. I'd seen it done, but I'd never actually tried it. So what I did is I marked the seam allowance along the front edge. And then I also marked where the lapel was gonna roll. And then I started doing small pad stitches through that lapel, curving it around my hand as I went to kind of really coax it into the right position. trimmed down the front piece of canvas, and I realized too late that I was supposed to trim it inside the seam line, not outside it. Oops. Next, I pinned in a thin twill tape just along the roll line of the lapel and the entire front edge of the piece. So theoretically this would go inside the seam line, but clearly I had misunderstood the instructions. So I stitched that all down, realized my mistake. I'm gonna unpick this and I'm gonna do it again and it will be absolutely fine. And redid it. Okay, all done. And I have catch stitched the canvas to the darts as well. I really like the way that the pad stitching kind of forms this into a nice curve, because I rolled it around my hand as I was doing it, which is what the instructions said to do. It gives it a lot of really nice shape, which I knew was a thing, but I didn't actually believe it until I saw it. But like, look at that. I mean, it really wants to just flop over that way. So that's all done. Now I have to rinse and repeat for the other one, so wish me luck. Once both the front pieces were done, the shoulder seam gets stitched together with a bit of twill tape on that seam line to reinforce it. I pinned the side seams and tried it on, and it was all looking pretty good. I pad stitched the collar much in the same way as the lapel, and then I pinned it to the neck of the bodice, where I ran into a little problem. I never know what this is. This happened when I made my waistcoat too, from Black Snail, the 1890s waistcoat. And I have these little triangles, and I don't know where they came from or what they're doing there. I have managed to stretch the collar to kind of fit those weird little bits, and that actually made it sit a little bit better, which is what the instructions say to do. They say to ease it in at the shoulders. The only wonky bit I have now is here, but I think that's just a bit of weird seam allowance, because you can kind of see that it comes up a bit and this one doesn't. So I'm just gonna leave that one, but otherwise, I will go ahead and sew this down with my 10,000 pins in there. Good times. Then I very carefully sewed it on. I mean, seriously, this is about 20 times speed. Clearly, my machine did not like sewing that collar. I probably should have used a longer stitch length or something. I'm not entirely sure what I did wrong there. My machine was not happy, but you know, it is what it is. It's fine. The collar's attached. After that, I sewed on the front facing, stitching just along the outside of that twill tape and then pivoting at the corner of the lapel. Then I clipped and trimmed down my seam allowances. The pattern told me to understitch all of those seams to the canvas, which I was very skeptical of at first, but once I actually did it, I could definitely see how much of a difference it made. Especially on that front facing, you can see how neat that seam is and how it like rolls so cleanly to the inside. So highly recommend understitching. It is tedious, but it really, really makes a difference. Then I put on the top collar piece. I understitched that too, and I turned it the right way. Front facing then gets its seam allowance turned under and stitched to the collar by hand. Finally, we sew the bodice seams for real, and the bodice is done. Putting the skirt together was super easy, so easy that I did not film it. Sorry about that. It was literally just 3 seams in the facings though, so not particularly difficult. It's all very clear in the pattern. I did put in the pockets at this stage into the outer fabric so that they would sit between the outer layer and the lining. I thought that would be a neater finish on both the inside and the outside, so you can't see the pockets, they're completely hidden. It was a bit silly of me though to French seam them. I don't know why I did that, considering that the raw edges were going to be completely hidden anyway. So that was my mistake. I also made sure to stitch in a bit of twill tape to the top of the pocket. That gets sewn into the waist seam to help distribute the weight of whatever's in your pockets. I do this in all of my pocketed skirts now. It is a trick from the Victorian era, and it really, really does make a difference. So if you sew anything with pockets, would recommend. So at this point, I pinned the skirt to where I thought the waist of the bodice should sit, and this is when I realized that I was being very silly, and the skirt definitely did not want to sit up that high. With the bulk of the fleece, the seam was basically right under my bust, which was not flattering. Empire waistlines can be cute, but not with me and not with this pattern. So I repinned it with the seam allowance that the pattern had given me, and it looked much, much nicer. This posed a little bit of a problem now because I had already cut and sewn the lining directly at the waistline, so theoretically it was gonna end up being a lot shorter than the fleece. I ended up being able to adjust for that at the hem just bringing the fleece up a little bit more, so it wasn't a huge deal, but if you're looking really closely, you can see that the waist seam for the lining sits ever so slightly higher than the outer fabric. It's not really noticeable unless you know, though, like unless you're comparing the back and the front. It did not matter, but I did regret being so impulsive with chopping up the lining earlier. That was not my best idea. The other issue with the whole moving the waist thing was that I had planned on my pockets being 4 inches below my waist, which is where I usually put them, but then when I decided to move the waistline down to where it was supposed to be, the pockets had already been sewn in. So they're a little bit lower than I would like. They're a little bit hard to find when I wear the coat, but they're still functional. It's not a huge deal. I also did not film any of this, but I did understitch the skirt facing the same way that I did the front lapel. So the front has a really nice clean edge all the way down. I understitched the pockets, I felled the top of the skirt facing to the canvas of the bodice, and now we're ready to finish the body. At this point, all I really had left to do for the body was put the lining in. So usually you would have done the sleeves first on both the outer fabric and the lining, and then you could just kind of line it up and fell it down at the end of the sleeves. But because I was doing my whole 4 different sleeves nonsense, I turned in the seam allowance at the arm size and I felled that down to the same as the rest of the lining. And then the last thing I needed to do was sew on the snap tape. So I cut the ribbon to the right length and I sewed the peg side to the inside of the arm size, felling down both sides of the tape. And now, the moment you've all been dreading.
Sleeve hole.
Times 4.
All of the sleeve pieces. Yay.
So the pattern actually tells you to use the smaller gathered sleeve as the lining for both types of sleeves. So it's only the outer fabric that's different. So I decided to start off doing those gathered sleeves out of the lining. So I sewed the 2 seams and then I ran 2 lines of gathering stitches along the top. And then I gathered it up and tried it on. All right, so what's wrong with this picture? Take a good look. Yeah. This is where my elbow is, and this is where the elbow of the sleeve is. So yeah, I had some work to do. What I did first was take a couple of inches off the bottom of the sleeve because the whole thing was simply too long. I was reluctant to alter the top of the sleeve because I still wanted it to have that nice gathered puffy look. So instead I brought both of the seams down a couple of inches and I smoothed them up into the curve so that I wouldn't have to change the top at all. I did move the curve of the undersleeve down and cut that away. This ended up not quite working. The undersleeve was fine, if a bit short, but the top now had this weird oblong shape, which was like not super cute. The curve of the piece was just a bit too dramatic to work for a puff sleeve. What I ended up doing was adding an inch back to the top of the seam and bringing the curve down to smooth it out. And then I added a bit back to the hem since I'd shortened it too much. I made sure to change the undersleeve to match too. So I recut my pieces, I sewed it again, and I tried it on. The elbow still wasn't perfect, but it was much closer and I figured it would be fine. So then I recut the fleece with the adjusted pattern and I sewed and gathered those in the same way. And then I flipped the lining the right way so that I could line up the sleeves wrong sides together. I then basted the gathered tops together. To finish those raw edges, I cut a strip of leftover satin and I sewed it to the lining, and then I flipped and felled it to the fleece. And then I sewed on the other end of the snap tape and I clipped the sleeves into the body of the coat. There are 17 snaps on each sleeve, so yeah, it took a while. So I tried it on and I measured where I wanted the sleeve hem to hit, and then I pinned a wide strip of canvas above that line, turned up the fleece, and felled it to the canvas. This gives the sleeve a bit of structure at the hem and it makes it a lot easier to get on and off. Then I turned in the lining and I felled it to the fleece, and the sleeves are done. 2 of them, anyway. So then I sewed the buttonholes by hand since there are only 4 of them. There's 3 on the outside and then there's 1 on the inside for a hidden button. My waistcoat from Black Snail does this too. It has that hidden button on the inside, which kind of just helps both sides of the double-breasted body sit in the right places. It's not really necessary to do it up. I don't always do it when I'm just wearing the coat casually, but it can be helpful for a really nice clean look. And then I sewed on these gorgeous buttons that I got for an absolute steal at my favorite sewing store here in London. If you've been on this channel, you know the Kilburn store, Rainbow Fabrics, I love it. But yeah, the buttons were like 25 pence a piece, so it was excellent. Now at this point the coat was wearable, which was an issue. And it was an issue because I then had 0 motivation to actually work on the second set of sleeves. Since I could already wear the thing, what was the point? So that was the beginning of December, and I did not work on the sleeves again until last week. But that ended up being okay because I got a lot of wear out of the coat in the meantime, and now I can give you a really good review of the pattern and my thoughts on it having worn the coat for a good few months there. We'll get to that. First, let's make these sleeves. So this sleeve pattern came with both versions on the same pattern piece, so it was really easy for me to alter it just by using the smaller version that I'd already changed. So I just lined up the pieces and I traced where the changes were, and then I brought the curve of the top down to meet the new lines. I also made sure to transfer the markings for the pleats. And then I cut the pattern out and cut my fabric to fit. I marked the pleat positions with pins and then I folded the pleats in place. This pattern calls for a very specific type of pleat that they call a military rolled pleat. So basically this is one pleat tucked inside another. It kind of makes sense on the pattern with the way that the arrows are pointing. So the way I figured it out was you fold point A to point C and then you kind of tuck that pleat towards the back, and then you wrap point D around the front to meet point B. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what worked in my head. My fleece was pretty thick, so the pins didn't match up exactly and I ended up eyeballing a lot of it, but they turned out okay anyway. I also switched directions halfway through so that the middle pleat would be a nice box pleat. I thought that looked good. So then I basted those pleats down, and after that I sewed the side seam. Because this is such a giant puffy sleeve, the pattern suggests putting in a sleeve head roll to support the puff. So this is 2 layers of cotton batting with a piece of canvas sandwiched in between. That gets pinned to the inside of the fashion fabric with the fullest parts matching up. If I was gonna do this again, I would definitely pin it below the seam allowance to cut down on the bulk right at the arm side. I don't know why I pinned it over the seam allowance, that was not a good idea. But anyway, I whip stitched that into place, making sure to catch all of the layers of the sleeve head roll. So then it's just a matter of finishing the sleeves the same way I did the first pair. So you put the lining in wrong sides together, baste the top, except I backstitched it because at this point I've secured these pleats like 3 different ways, but I was still paranoid about them coming apart. I don't know why. Turn it inside out, bind the top with satin that is entirely too narrow and will be very annoying to sew on, and why didn't I just cut a wider strip? Why am I like this? And finally, I attached the snap tape and finished the cuffs with canvas and a felling stitch. And so, 5 months later, the coat is finally finished. Okay, class, let's review. What have we learned? Okay, well, first off, I am absolutely sold on the idea of pad stitching and understitching. Listen to me. I know it seems like a pain, and trust me, I did not believe that it actually made a difference. I was like, this is a thing that nobody actually needs to do. It won't affect the final look, but it does. It really does make a difference. The front edge of the coat is just so nice and clean and neat, and the lapel just rolls beautifully into place. So yeah, I'm definitely not going to skip this step in the future. I will be bringing this along on other projects. I think they're really, really good techniques and they're really useful. Now the 4 different sleeves thing, that was an insane idea. It was absolutely insane. But I think it actually kind of worked. I mean, I love how dramatic the bigger sleeves are, and I think they really sell the historical effect. Like, I feel like the giant puffy sleeves with the waistcoat and the skirt, it's $18.95. They're just really cool. I just love them. But they're also, you know, very dramatic. So I'm really glad that I have the smaller ones for a more like history bounding everyday kind of look. Quick story time. I had just finished the bigger sleeves and I was heading to a Victorian themed bar, and I'm just walking down the street and a guy is walking next to me and he just like looks at me and he like does a double take and he's like, "Where are you going?" And I was like, "Sorry." And he's like, "Sorry, if you don't mind my asking, where are you going?" And I was like, "Victorian themed bar." And he's like, "Oh, okay. You look good." And I was like, "Thanks." They're not casual by any means. They are definitely a head turner. Now, having worn the bigger sleeves for a little bit, I did notice that there's like a funny pulling, and I'm not entirely sure what happened there. Because I did 4 sleeves, there was a lot of room for error. Something was gonna go wrong. My theory is that when I inserted the linings, I got them mixed up because there is a right and a left. I have checked it since though. I did like turn it inside out and see if it looked like it was the wrong lining, but it looked correct. So I'm not entirely sure what I did there, but it just, when I put it on, it feels like the lining and the outer layer don't match up, and if you look really closely, you can actually see that like the sleeve bunches towards the bottom. Yeah, so it's not great. I mean, it is wearable, but I might go back and try and fix those later, like just take out the lining and see if I can fix it. I'm not sure, because I did secure those pleats really well, so it would be a lot of like taking it apart. And these are mostly a costume piece anyway, so I'm not like particularly fussed if they are not perfect. So I might leave it, I might fix it, I'm not entirely sure. Now, like I said, the coat has actually been wearable since December, so I wore it pretty much through the coldest months of winter. It's February now, it's starting to warm up a little bit. But I was genuinely surprised by how warm it was, because we were like sub-zero temperatures in Celsius for like a week or two, and it was absolutely freezing outside, and I felt quite warm in my coat, so I was really surprised by that. The pattern actually recommended a quilted inner lining, but I didn't think I'd need it because essentially, I mean, I was making it out of a blanket. It was gonna be pretty warm. It is super cozy and it kept me really warm throughout the winter. And I got loads of compliments on the style and the fit of it, so that was really nice too. The only thing is that I've started to notice that the fleece is wearing away a little bit. It's starting to pill slightly. It was a pretty cheap blanket. It was never gonna be like excellent quality. I'm not too worried about it. I can always patch it up if it starts to go really thin, and I think I can still get a good few years of wear out of this coat, which is the important thing. I'll mend it if I have to, but yeah, I'm not particularly worried about it. So would I recommend this pattern? Yes, definitely, but probably not for absolute beginners. Like, I wouldn't do this as your very first project. It is a little bit daunting, honestly. There was a lot of like fiddly hand sewing and techniques that I probably wouldn't have understood when I first started sewing. I think having made the waistcoat and the skirt from patterns by the same company, I kind of understand how all of the shapes work and how the whole thing gets put together, especially from the waistcoat, because it's it's a similar cut, right? So yeah, I found this one a little bit easier than the waistcoat just because I kind of already knew what I was doing. So it is an excellent pattern. I do recommend it. I mean, it's beautiful. I really, really love the pattern. But yeah, it is a bit complicated, so probably not for absolute beginners. I mean, unless you're really keen to dig into something complex, in which case, you know, more power to you, do it. Just be aware that it might be a little bit daunting. But making this coat was really fun, and I'm pretty proud of myself for managing it, honestly, because I've never actually made outerwear unless you count like a really ill-fitting cloak, which it still boggles my mind that that cloak fits so badly, because it's a cloak. How does it not wrap around my shoulders? I just don't understand. That was my only other piece of outerwear, and this is much more of a success. I mean, the fact that I made this coat and it's held up to me wearing it essentially every day for, you know, a good 3 months. Yeah, I'm really proud of that. I think that's really exciting. I still consider myself kind of a beginner moving up to intermediate sewist, so Listen, take this as a sign. Whatever pattern that you've been wanting to work on, if I can do this, so can you, because I make a lot of mistakes and I managed to make this work, so you got this. I think that was everything I wanted to say. Nope, I forgot to say, let me know if you enjoyed this style of video with me kind of taking you through the process of the project after the fact, or if you prefer to be kind of down in the trenches with me figuring it out as we go. I like both formats for different reasons, so I don't know, let me know what you think. So thank you for coming along with me on this coat making adventure. I hope it was fun for you, it was fun for me, and I will see you next time. Bye! I hope you enjoyed your cup of tea with me.